polysaccharides, remember. Okay, polysaccharides can have a couple different functions in living organisms. Some of them are used as storage tanks. Storage polysaccharides at the top. Let's talk about those first. The only, there's a difference of whether or not you're a plant or animal as to what kind of storage polysaccharides you have. In plants, it's starch. Like that potato that I just showed you guys, that was definitely considered a starch. That's why it turned black in the presence of that Lugol solution. Wow, that doesn't take long to boil over there, does it?
No, it's going down, and one of them's green.
Yeah, very good. I'm just still let it go though.
Are you sure it's green, Tyler? It looks blue. I think you're colorblind.
No, the other one, for sure.
I can't see nothing but Justin's head.
Oh, my head. Jordan.
Oh my God.
I didn't hear it.
That was horrible.
Go,
All right, moving forward.
Go, Justin.
We got color change going on here.
Jordan wanted this video.
Anyway, moving forward.
Justin just burned Jordan.
Thanks to some serious editing.
No, mister, leave that in.
Don't say anything. Don't see if he watches it.
Yeah, that's fine. Okay, so wow, if you're a plant, listen. This is let me. If you're a plant, you store sugars as starch. If you're an animal, you store sugars in the form of glycogen. If you're diabetic, any diabetics in the room? Okay. Okay. Or you know someone. It's very common, actually. Let me give you an example of how this works. When you guys eat a lot of glucose. Okay, so you can't have all that glucose inside of you. If you have too much glucose in your bloodstream, it's bad. Okay? People who are diabetic, have diabetes, cannot control the amount of glucose they have in their blood. Normally, your system has ways to keep it in check. But people who are diabetic basically have too much or too little sugar in their blood. Well, what we need to do is find a place to put that extra glucose to store it, a storage tank. You can't store it as glucose. You have to store it in the liver, in your liver cells, and as glycogen. It's a different molecule. So that's kind of there. Hey, there's also other carbohydrates that don't have a storage function, but they have a structural function. In other words, plants. What makes plant leaves so tough is the fact that they're made out of cellulose. Okay? This is not the same cellulose and lay, and you get old, you get that cellulite. Okay? It's cellulose. Animals don't have cellulose. In fact, when we eat plant material, when we eat a lot of cellulose from plant material, we can't digest it real well. We end up kind of pooping it out. All right? But animals do have a structural polysaccharide called chitin. Now, we don't. Only certain animals do. It's found in the exoskeletons of arthropods. You guys name me. You know the really loud one you hear these days outside at night? All those cicada and locusts of the locust family.
So annoying.
They are so annoying. I couldn't agree with you more. They are so annoying. Do you guys see, if you go out to the trees, you can see their little shells they leave behind when they mold?
Those are so cool.
They are cool.
So
I will say that. Those are really neat to just see all these shells of these locusts or cicadas. Those shells are real tough and hard. The reason they're tough or hard is because they're made of this stuff right here called chitin. Okay. Humans, obviously, we don't have an exoskeleton. It would be cool if we did. We don't. Okay. Moving on. Macromolecule number 2 are lipids, otherwise known as fats. They're a secondary energy source. Basically, what that means is if there aren't any carbohydrates around, your cells in your body will turn to lipids to break them down. They also have a couple other jobs. They are the major part of your cell membranes. Okay, you guys are made up of a lot of cells. I'm sure you pretty much figured it out by now. You have a lot of cells inside of you. Each of those cells is surrounded by a plasma membrane. Believe it or not, a big part of that plasma membrane is fat. And this is why fats are needed in your diet. You can't not have fats in your diet. Also, a lot of those hormones that are raging around in you guys right now, those are considered to be fats. Cholesterol, which you actually need as well in your diet, is made up of lipids, or lipids. Okay. Here's the... For carbohydrates, I told you that the general formula was like C6H12O6. Very similar to lipids. The big difference being, when you look at this chemical formula, I want you to see this and know that it's a lipid and not a carbohydrate. How do you know? Easy. There's a lot of C's, there's a lot of H's, there are not very many O's. Remember, if you go back in your notes for carbohydrates, you had like twice as many H's as you would C's and O's. Totally different here. You have a lot of C's and a lot of H's, but very few O's. I want you guys to actually know that. An example of a lipid in nature are phospholipids. Now, these are the little suckers that actually make up your cell membranes. You have a bunch of these molecules that basically surround the cell and hold in the contents. And I basically just kind of showed you that they have kind of two parts to them. They have they're basically a lipid with a phosphate on the top, so you have a phosphate kind of head. Everything's polar. You have these two tails for the fatty portions that are nonpolar. Here's what's really cool. You have this molecule that makes up your cell membranes that's a little bit polar on one end, a little bit nonpolar on the other end. That is a cool molecule. We're going to see that in the future, because because it has a little bit of a positive end and a little bit of a non-positive end, it does some pretty cool things. So, lipids. I might as well show you real quickly what you would do to test for lipids. Guys, it's easy. Right in front of Tyler here. Oh, that's okay. You can just stay right there.
I'm gonna move a little back over here.
You know how when you go...
Oh, wait, good.
No, you're fine. You know how when you go to, like, a Mexican restaurant, if you've ever been there, and they put, like, if you ever get a to-go order, they'll put your chips in a bag or something. And then by the time you get home, you notice that, like, the bag is filled with, like, greasy spots all over it. Or a pizza box will do the same thing. A pizza box will have these greasy spots over it. And no matter how many days have gone by, those greasy spots never disappear. Well, I'll tell you what. That's your test for fats. Control group, I just put a couple drops of water. Over here, I put a couple drops of oil. It's long since dried. Anything that has a fat is going to leave a greasy spot. Guys, this is what the forensic people do to test for the presence of a lipid in some kind of substance. I mean, this is not high-tech stuff, but it works. Isn't that cool? So, the greasy spot, which is totally dry, stays behind.
Smell it.
You guys are going to be testing an unknown substance. You'll be putting that unknown substance on a piece of brown paper rag, and you're going to be letting it dry. And if it still has a mark behind like that, there's a lipid in there.
Jeez.
Pretty easy, huh? All right. Let's move on to proteins, and then I'll be done for the day.
Is that thing done yet? Oh yeah, one's green. I can see.
It's big.
Huh?
Hey,
I'm going to
Guess
rewrite
what?
this out.
don't tell me what's going on.
Am I going to need to start a new page for this?
Proteins are next. Okay. Remember how I said carbohydrates, their main job is to be the primary energy source for your cells. Your cells love carbohydrates to make energy. Well, if that's not around, they'll turn to lipids. And they'll turn those into energy. Proteins have a totally different function. They have nothing to do with energy. However, proteins are, I think, of all the 4 macromolecules, I think they're kind of the coolest because they do the most. In other words, proteins. I remember my professor told me, you are just big bags of proteins. Well, that's because proteins have so many different jobs. So the first thing I want to do is go through some of those jobs with you guys, just so you understand how diverse they are, how many different jobs they have in living organisms. Some proteins are there to provide defense. All of those antibodies that are floating around inside living organisms are proteins. Some proteins act as chemical messengers. In other words, they relay messages from one place to another. Those are hormones. Hey, by the way, I know you saw hormones. Hormones can either be lipids or proteins. Okay. Some proteins are there to provide movement for certain organisms. Your muscle cells contain quite a lot of protein. Some proteins are there for something called cell recognition. You recognize something. Well, okay. What that means is, if I have a cell, and I have another cell, and they want to recognize each other, they want to determine whether they're good or bad or whatever they are, they have little receptors. Every cell has little receptors on its surface. Hey, remember, this kind of looks like a virus, but I'm not supposed to be trying to write it that way. Every cell has little receptors on the surface that will recognize or not recognize other cells or other particles. Okay? So I'll write the word receptors kind of below it. Those are proteins. You have other proteins that are designed to help transport substances in and out of cells. I don't know about your guys' cells, but my cells better be picky about what they let in and out of them. Austin, please put the chair down and face forward. Thank you. Proteins are there to help move things in and out of the cell. Simple as that. Some proteins have a structural job. Your guys' skin, protein. All right, so you get the idea. In other words, I think the proteins are one of the most important macromolecules inside of you because they do so many different things. They're very diverse. Okay.
I get that.
Here, go ahead. All right, I'm drawing down a This looks complicated, but really it's not. Bear with me. Wow, okay. You see some carbons, you see some hydrogens, you see some oxygens. This is basically the fundamental unit of a protein. Okay. What I just drew here is something called an amino acid. And what I want you guys to remember is that if you take a bunch of amino acids like you see here and hook them up together, they'll make a protein. Let me represent, the circles are going to be your amino acids, and they're all hooked up. I've just made myself a protein. And each of those circles represents an amino acid like you see above. And just above, I just drew out what it looks like up close and personal. You can see all the atoms that are in an amino acid. Proteins have another name when they're strung together like that called polypeptides. Yeah, you should probably understand that the word polypeptide has something to do with a protein. It's the same thing. Protein and a polypeptide are very similar. Okay, I have this R group thing here though. This R group can vary from amino acid. You have 20 different amino acids that are known in nature. And the only reason they vary is because of what's attached to that article. Okay, here's my point. I know this is kind of getting a little technical, but proteins basically are long strings of amino acids. They can be one of 20 amino acids. And basically, the sequence of what those amino acids are determines what protein you get. Remember that picture I showed yesterday? Oh, no. Let me see if I can find it real quickly. It was that blue blob thing. Okay. Yesterday I showed you this thing. And I said, okay. We were talking about enzymes yesterday, but remember, enzymes are proteins, so this is going to be my protein example right here, this blue thing. To make this protein, you had to put a bunch of amino acids together. Now, when you line up a bunch of those amino acids in a big long line, they're not going to stay in a big long line. They're going to do exactly what you see here. They're going to fold up on each other and turn into a big blob. Okay. But remember what we said yesterday, that big blob has a certain shape and a very specific shape that's going to go on to do something very specific. This shape results from which amino acids are hooked up and in which order they're hooked up. So definitely the sequence matters. Okay, so what I want you guys to remember now is that, oh, well, here, that's kind of what I drew down here. Yeah, it's all great and fine and dandy to know which amino acids make up this protein, but what's going to end up happening is those amino acids are going to fold in on each other to create this 3D protein that's going to actually be functional. Proteins don't work if they're in a line. They have to form into a blob in order to work. So, let me show you guys some pictures, because pictures are awesome. No, I think you're done writing, so pictures are good.
That's the only kind of books I get, picture books.
Okay, so I'm kind of going back. This is kind of more or less a review. Okay, so far we've covered 3 out of the 4 major macromolecules found in living organisms. We haven't covered the nucleic acid yet, the one on the far right. We'll get to that tomorrow. But we started off talking about carbohydrates. That's kind of what's represented by the green structure. You can kind of see that ring that I drew. That ring connects to other rings and forms kind of a big long chain. Definitely a carbohydrate. Okay, lipid. Let's ignore that for now because that looks complicated. But I like this protein picture because you can really see how this protein kind of looks like a big blob of just a blob. That shape of this is very important to determine what it does as its job. Lipid. I want to show you a picture of a lipid. Don't freak out. It's kind of big. Lipids are huge molecules. This thing is one giant molecule. Okay, I'm showing you this not so you can be freaked out at all the C's and H's and O's that you're seeing, but I'm kind of showing you this for a reason. Excuse me. Fats are really big molecules compared to the other ones. But really, look at it's actually a really simple molecule. You have this yellow part that's called a glycerol. I'm not concerned you know that, but it's made up of 3 carbons. Okay. Then you have these little carbon chains running down from it. These carbon chains are the portion. Remember when I drew that little phospholipid? These little tails that you drew, are made up of, basically are represented by this little box in green. All these carbon and hydrogens, they're the very non-polar portion of the molecule. Okay. I don't think I want to go into too much more detail about that. What's over here? Oh, they're showing you just a different way to represent a carbohydrate. Okay. I wanted to show you one more. I don't think I showed this yesterday. Did I show this one yesterday? It's kind of black and white and boring to look at, but it actually kind of talks a lot. If I talked about it yesterday, I'm just going to repeat myself. Okay, we're talking about carbohydrates only. Kind of jumping all over the place, but talking about carbohydrates only. Remember today we talked about a starch and glycogen. A starch is an example of a carbohydrate. Glycogen is an example of a carbohydrate. Starch is found just in plants. Glycogen is found just in animals. Look, you see this little bug here. That's where the glycogen is coming from. They took this little worm that's like on this piece of corn, and they're telling you that the glycogen is inside of there. Yeah. The ones that I just put in the box, the glycogen and starch, remember, those are your storage forms of polysaccharide. Remember, we also talked about cellulose today as being the other type of polysaccharide that's found in plants only. Cellulose is only found in plants. They don't have chitin up here. They should have had like some little cicada across the bottom of the page, and then they would be able to show chitin, but they didn't. Again, the whole point of this is just to show you that there's different forms of carbohydrates. They're everywhere. Plants, animals, whatever. And I think that's it. Questions, guys? Hey, remember, how are your experiments? I saw some people working on their experiments earlier.